Welcome to Let's Talk Better Forestry, a space for conversations about forests, the people who work with them, and the policies that shape them. We're here to slow things down a bit, to go beyond the headlines and hear from the people behind the work, in their own words. Honest, thoughtful, sometimes messy conversations, but always grounded in real experience.
Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Better Forestry podcast. And today I'm delighted to be joined by the co-convener at the Forest Policy Group, who is Alan McDonnell. So welcome, Alan. Great to have you along. I know you've got a lot of roles. Just being a convener of Forest Policy Group is just one tiny cog in the machine of your life. So would you like to let us know what some of your other roles are and what you do?
Yeah, hi Mog. Sure, my day job is with Trees for Life, where I'm head of nature restoration. And I guess the other big thing I do on top of Forest Policy Group is I convene Links Woodland Group. So that's a group of NGOs working together on policy for woodland and forestry work. So it gives me a spread across NGO and the nature conservation sector. Trees for Life is a rewilding charity, and then FPG focused on diverse forestry and community benefit.
And could you just give us an outline of what an average day or an average week would look like in your Trees for Life job? Just like what are some of the things you...
There isn't really one, but I guess some of the issues that, I guess my role is split between so I manage our habitat ecology team, and they're very focused in particular on pine woods at the minute and on identifying ancient woodland remnants in the landscape. So they have great jobs going out and doing survey work in places where they've found evidence that there could be ancient woodland, and they're out there confirming that. And some of the stuff to do with the pine sites, these wild pine sites we find that are ancient pine woods that aren't on the Caledonian Pinewood Inventory, they're kind of building the evidence around that. And then the other part of the team's working on species reintroductions. So got a colleague working on beavers. Have had a colleague working on squirrels until recently, another colleague working on potential for lynx reintroduction to Scotland.
Right.
And all the policy stuff as well kind of is on that. So we've had kind of working in research and evidence and policy towards supporting nature restoration at scale and how communities can benefit from that.
Right, so really widespread really across those different areas, even just within the one organisation. Do you ever find that the varying roles in the organisation or across the groups that you work with, do they always align or do they ever pull you in different directions?
I think they all fit together. So whilst, that is broad when I say it out loud, they're all part of a piece. So for us, it's the classic three pillars of kind of nature, environment as a basis of life, but the economies that make those work can make those viable and keep all that work going is a vital part of that as well, as is the kind of social connections and the glue that holds that together in the human world. So those three things are all equally important, and that means just being in one niche at one time isn't going to work. So there's a need for that spread, and therefore, whilst different parts of those roles are focused on different aspects of that triumvirate, they do all. I certainly see them all as complementary.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I was really interested to talk to you about today, because I know you've been involved with it for some time now, is the Common Ground Forum about deer. So could you talk us through that process, right from the kind of beginning of how did it come about and what's the process been like and where do you see it going? And of course, why it's important in the first place.
Yeah, for me, it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest kind of sign for hope for us, and certainly in the work that I do. It started when a couple of people, Richard Cook and Tom Turnbull, from the Association of Deer Management Groups, so the kind of representing the traditional side of the deer management sector, approached a colleague who'd recently arrived in plant life, Julie Stoneman, and she was coordinating the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest. And they said, can we talk about having better relationships between the deer management sector and the nature sector? And Julie went to all the members of her alliance and said, well, what do we think about this? Tom and Richard seemed very much in earnest about this. And they're like, no, don't trust them. And very much a product of how that debate had been at odds for so long and the way communication wasn't really there. Um, and Julie came back and said, no, but they've come back again and they really want to do this. And so myself and someone else said, well, okay, we can't just keep having this situation forever. But nor can we continue to have just sort of superficial talks that seem to kind of address stuff on the surface. We'd all spent, a long time in that kind of meeting. So how do we go under the surface to what's really driving this? And find and see if that can transcend the debate into something more constructive, progressive. And serendipitously, Julie knew the Centre for Good Relations, Sam Tedcastle, Abdul Rahim, and they have experience in all sorts of, I guess, conflict resolution, conflict management, facing into that, often from quite urban contexts, with interracial and sectarian tensions and facing into those really hardcore stuff. And we thought that sounds a bit right for us. And so just gently, a few people from each side started talking about how this could work in practice. Credit to the Woodland Trust and others who put money behind that and brought Sam and Abdul on board. And they spent a year talking to people all around the issue and basically making a map of stakeholders. And they would go back and present that to the different stakeholder groups and say, so here's what you're saying about each other. Here's where you are in this, and here's where your priorities are, and here's what you feel about them, and what the kind of key conflict issues are. And on the back of that, and really taking the time to build relationships with all of those people and through them. So it's all coming into them at one stage and back out again, just sort of one-way stuff. Well, two-way, but no mixing between the stakeholder groups. And it took a year to really feel like they understood it. But they then said, well, the next step is then to bring these groups to talk to each other and not through us. And so we did that. About 50 people went to Stirling for 2 nights and met and had a slightly stilted first evening. And then the next morning, it was sort of introduction. It was all very civil, as you'd expect. But the next morning, really tried sort of, well, how are we going to surface all of this? And one of the moments I remember most is came after they said, right, we're going to separate you into your 3 tribes. So there's a nature organization tribe and a kind of sporting deer management tribe and academics and policy people. And we were all invited to say, so what do you think about the other 2 tribes? And what do you think they think about you? So the first tribe invited to get up and speak was the policy, academia, government side, and they said pretty British beige things that were all very neutral and designed not to offend. And then this sporting group, their spokespersons did something very similar. But it was fortunate that in our tribe, we had someone who's very keen actually to go in a very non-toxic way, just to be really direct. And so I'll not name them, but they really impressed me. They stood up and they just, well, it's just like this. We think that the other side say they're invested in nature, but we're not sure they are. And we think that they think that we're not, and we don't care about sporting interests or their jobs. Really direct stuff. And I could swear the room got about 2 degrees colder. And another depth of silence met that. And Sam and Abdul had the experience just to let that sit. And it had been said, and then they moved into under exercise. But because someone had gone there and named it, the elephants were starting to get named, then the whole thing just started to move. And so we came out of those kind of 3 days together. Second night was again much more mixed up, and in the barn it was a really good night. And we left Stirling with a real sense of, right, this can go somewhere else now and this can move on. And we've just been doing that, kept sort of reaching out to more people, to involve more people in the process and to give them space. Sam and Abdul's skill in many ways is to create a safe space for them to share what they really think and for that to feel heard and for people to kind of appreciate the chance to get that insight about what happens in that other bubble. And you almost conclude for yourself, oh, so we've got the same, there is common ground and that's what it is. And it doesn't mean we're going to agree on what should happen next or what we want to happen or how we are going to act in our interests. But it means that we can talk about it openly and we can look for mutually beneficial solutions and ways we can act. And that's actually, so far, those kind of joint actions are starting to grow. And long may that continue because it means, so for instance, Scottish Environment Link and Association of Deer Management Groups and Scottish Land and Estates all signed the same letter to the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee about aspects of the Natural Environment Bill. And so we want joint funding to come in to enable deer management. And that would have been unthinkable 4 years ago.
Yeah, a big change. And so is that the most kind of tangible outcome so far, that you're managing to start singing from the same hymn sheet on some things, or are there other aspects too that people might be interested to hear about?
I think there's quite a lot of that sort of joint advocacy. So that's kind of geared. So we've written together on venison, we've written together on potential legislation and how policy can change. There have been now 4 workshops for stalkers. So it was recognised early on that deer stalkers aren't naturally participants in this sort of talking process, talking shop, and that is this just a talking shop, and how comfortable will they feel in that sort of environment. So we basically went about forming relationships direct with them and have gradually pulled them into the process. And so there have been about probably 400 stalkers have come to 4 different workshops, probably more than that now, in terms of numbers. And so that kind of exchange of experience and professionals talking to each other about their very practical jobs, from really with quite diverse aims. So from sporting estates through to conservation estates through to rewilding estates, they've all kind of worked together. So there's been positive stuff there on training. And other stuff as well, working with deer management groups on conflict management. So a range of people from around the forum have kind of participated.
Sorry, we lost you there for a second, Alan. Would you like to just go back to the beginning of that train of thought and continue?
Yeah, sure. I was just talking about the training that's happened through the Common Ground Forum. So in handling conflict and looking to de-escalate that and how people do that. So, that can be really important because conversations will continue to be heated. And the more people there are who can take a wee step back of that, step out of it and stop that kind of relationships breaking down in the heat of that moment. It's just another way of kind of just trying to reduce the temperature and get us on to a point, well, how can we find collaborative ways forward through this? So that's just, you can't manage deer and achieve these aspirations for our landscapes without collaboration. And it's just been so dysfunctional in so many places for so long that that's kind of why this is such a kind of a cause for hope about how things can develop in the future.
Yeah, and I want to get on to, just in case anyone who's listening doesn't know why it's important to manage deer from a tree and forest perspective, but just staying on this sort of mediation process that you've been taking part in, because there's so much polarity across all sorts of things in rural Scotland at the moment. Do you see potential for this type of process to be mapped onto other places where there's conflict? And do you think there's any way of, with this one having been done, shortcutting slightly so everything doesn't take a year and a half to even get people in the same room or on the same page?
So yes, certainly yes to that. There are principles about the way the Common Ground Forum has worked that I think probably have to be brought into other spheres and other areas of polarity. And I think that's about giving people the time to find what connects them underneath. So these kind of with this tendency to conflict and tension comes from often it comes from how strongly people feel about these issues and about land and the range of things we can get from that and the way that when those are different, people can often end up feeling like they just need to talk about what's important about their perspective. And then there's the other side feeling unheard and the vice versa starts to spiral into a long-term conflict.
Mm.
So I think we need to kind of spend the time to understand, well, what's underneath. We hold these positions that appear to be in opposition. Why? And can we talk about that in a safe, objective manner? And what does that tell us about? Could we both get what we want from this? What is in this? What's in this future that we both aspire to, that we share, and how much of it is present in this conflict today that actually doesn't really matter? We're just holding on to it because it's just for other reasons, or we see it as part of a process that gets us. So we're actually, if we work together, maybe we don't need that stuff. We can leave that behind, and we can go work much more smoothly and much more happily towards a better future where there's room for both of our valid interests.
Yeah.
So whether you can shortcut that, I think that depends on the issue and the nature of the polarization or the nature of the disagreement, how embedded it is, how entrenched the personalities are, how threatened people feel. And a lot of this is about fear. But is it, and so some of it might end up taking less time or more time. But I think that will be time and money because it's the same that this takes money well spent. For instance, somebody was talking just the other day about the Common Ground Forum and the fact that it's not that cheap. And my response is, well, nor is it that expensive. And it's a fraction of the time and money spent on regulating and managing deer management and disagreements about deer management. So it's a far more efficient way that actually solves or has a prospect of solving the problem. Whereas all this other spend that goes on from, just from Nature Scott alone, never mind the rest of us, or other people who need to deal with deer issues and have to spend money to get around that. At least this way might address the problem rather than just try to contain it and keep it in a sort of explosive proof box.
Absolutely. And because I was going to ask you about, do you have any sense of what the level of sort of financial resources gone in? And you may or may not be able to answer that. But then, of course, there's also cost savings elsewhere and other knock-on integrations with the economy as well, isn't there? But do you have a sense of how much it's cost, just in case anyone's listening and they're thinking, oh, this sounds like a process we could do within this sector or with this issue?
Yeah, we spent, I think, on average about 100 grand a year.
Okay.
On the process. And we've pulled that from a range of sources, including grants and foundations, but members' contributions. I mentioned the Woodland Trust earlier, they were very generous, especially in the early years, and some government money. And we'd argue too, all of those funders, that's extremely well spent.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering if I'm going too off piste here, just say so. But do you think it would also have, it sounds to me as if it's a process, especially dealing with fear as it does, that would have knock-on benefits in other areas of everyone's work and life, because it's a different way of interacting with people.
Yeah, certainly I've learned a huge amount about how to hold yourself in those situations and when to let conflicting views just come out. Even when you sense a bit of attack or criticism within that, it's just to say, well, this is where somebody's coming from, and what are we looking for under that? What's beyond that? What's kind of really under this? And so that the stuff on the surface is often just not really relevant to sorting the thing out in the long run.
Yeah, and there's a real difference between disagreement and attack, isn't there? But I think we tend to roll them up into one thing in our society quite a lot because we don't make much space for that.
Well, especially when we're separated in bubbles, so the opportunities to interchange aren't there very much. So words carry much more weight.
Yeah,
in those situations, or the third party stuff where something's said in the press, and that's deemed as an attack. And I've had, through the Common Ground Forum process, so when you talk about there's some phrase somebody used which we thought was completely neutral. Oh, we talk about environmental groups and the NGOs will talk about Scotland being one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, purely as a way of kind of stating the scale of the problem and also the scale of the potential. But there are other stakeholders who see that as a direct attack on them. So
Hmm.
what they're hearing in brackets and unsaid is that and is the blame being placed at their door. I said,
Yeah.
wow, that wasn't intended
Yeah.
or even really thought because we know quite a lot about the causes of ecological decline, but many of those are long term and have come out of bigger uh, bigger economic drivers, which can be global in scale. So that in that kind of when you look at it in that frame, the idea of blame is just it's just a waste of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the significance of, yeah, how important some small things are to us that kind of fill our whole context of, worry about something or fear about something when, yeah, like you say, they're just this tiny, tiny cog in the whole machine. But yeah,
Mm.
we could probably end up in a big, long philosophical conversation about that. But I think it's super interesting and something that so many areas of modern day life at the moment
Yeah,
could
yeah.
benefit from. Yeah. I was said just a while ago, could you talk a little bit about why it is important to be looking at how we manage deer in this country, especially from a tree planting or natural colonization perspective, just because there may be people here who don't really know how that interface works.
Mm. So the reason, I guess, groups like Trees for Life want to see natural regeneration at scale is that's the kind of we see that as one of the big missing natural processes in our landscapes. The ability of native trees to set seed and to grow and mature and therefore actually kind of expand around the landscape. So you restore more habitat, but you also could have in that way you could have a mobility in those woodlands because slowly over time they can spread. If climate changes and you have species that are like say the Scots pine that is used to kind of cooler environments and say the glens are kind of warming up towards the bottom. If those pine woods have an ability to move uphill, then they can sustain themselves longer in that temperature belt, and that gives them that ability to move around. So, and with that, then the rest of nature, the rest of wildlife can continue to use that habitat and have options in this landscape. So, as they're also struggling with extremes of weather or gradual changes in climate, they've got options, places to find food, places to find shelter, and ways of maintaining kind of nature's natural cycles of seed set, regeneration, trees grow, leaves fall, soil is enriched, and more species can come in. And
Hmm.
in a long space of time, woodlands mature, old trees fall over, gaps open up, open ground insects and species come in, and another suite of species follows that, whilst regeneration is happening elsewhere. So the more we can have a landscape that's capable of that sort of natural dynamism, the more robust our biodiversity will be, uh, and as part of that, the stronger probably our natural climatic processes will be if you have more of that in the world.
Hmm.
So in Scotland, one of the biggest missing process in that is that ability for trees to do that, and that ability of trees to grow in that way, set seed and grow, that regenerate themselves, is herbivory. And certainly in the Highlands, but a lot of places, the main herbivore that's browsing those young trees, or browsing those baby trees and stopping them establish is deer. And so gradually, since the 50s, really, that's kind of been identified, and the roots of that kind of deer issue are at least that long. And it's mature now. So we've now had, the deer population has more than doubled since 1990 in Scotland.
Wow.
And so what was a problem in 1990 is now double a problem today in ecological terms.
Yeah. And
So
oh,
finding ways of bringing that about and creating the conditions whereby that can happen whilst allowing all the people who are based in that deer management livelihood to sustain those jobs and provide that essential skill that they've got. We can't do without them. We need them for it. And that's our big challenge, and we need to challenge that together.
hmm. Yeah. And so do you see a day coming in the future where we wouldn't need deer fencing for new woodlands if we can get deer numbers down to a manageable?
That's certainly ideal, is that you could, if we find a way to bring deer impacts down low enough that allows habitat to restore at scale, you could then have a landscape that's capable of supporting, once again, a higher deer population in balance with that. So the more habitat you have, the more deer you can have at a sustainable level, and then you potentially wouldn't need fencing to try and protect what you've got.
And do you want to say anything, just while we're on the topic, about was it the John Muir Trust? And I think you had some involvement, maybe, paper where they suggested that we could be achieving quite high numbers of tree establishment in Scotland over, is it the next 10 years?
Yes. So my colleague Darren did some work on basically the numbers of kind of current estimates of the deer population in Scotland, calculated the sort of the demographic shift in those populations that would bring in Scotland to a national average of 5 deer per square kilometre. And then use some real world data, most of which is based on Forestry Land Scotland deer management costs, of how much money does it cost to shoot a deer. So this is, and therefore this is mainly but not exclusively based on upland red deer. Although there'd be quite a lot of roe deer in those figures as well. And the number that came back was £189 per deer. And if you multiply that by the number of deer by which you would have to reduce the population number of deer you have to cull to hit that population target, you get to a range of numbers, but we settled on 15 million for the sake of argument to cover those costs. And then we worked with John Muir Trust to sort of think about, well, how could you apply that in policy terms, and what would the kind of the socioeconomic impact of that be? There's probably a few less than 1,000 stalkers in Scotland. So, that's 1,000 stalkers, 15 million is £15,000 a year in support of those salary costs. When you start to look at it through that lens, you can say, okay, if we get to 5 deer per square kilometre, which is a density at which this all really rule of thumb stuff, but in really rough terms, that's a density at which you would get some natural regeneration happening. And so Darren then, working on existing woodland data sets, multiplied that by the amount of regeneration you would get in I think in a 50-metre buffer, might have been 100-metre, I think it was 50-metre buffer around the existing native woodland. And you get to orders of magnitude of woodland expansion over a 10-year period that are well above what we're currently managed to create through a planting-led, grant-based approach. With the added bonus that you've then got that more sustainable deer population. And so that seed bank continues to grow, and you maintain the conditions at which those woodlands can continue to expand by themselves onto suitable soils for the long term. And if that also then unlocks the economic conundrum of how to maintain stalking jobs, then you've got the key ingredients there of a sustainable long-term solution. That with what could be the just transition for that profession.
And presumably we'd assume that, not that we can assume much, but that those trees would be more resilient because they're establishing through.
Yes. So in ecological terms, that's the best outcome, is to regenerate from natural seed. So you've got all of that, especially all our ancient woodlands, or all the remnants of ancient woodlands aren't even recognised as such, but you've got viable trees in areas. Trees for Life knows this because of our brilliant senior ecologist, James Rainey. James, a few years ago, started using the first edition of the Ordnance Survey and sometimes older maps like Roy and Punt to identify where there were historic they looked like native woodlands in the landscape. And he found that if there's a wee Christmas tree symbol on an 18 and 40 map, and you go to that exact grid reference, you might find a very mature Scots pine tree. So light bulbs started going off in his head, and we now use that method as a kind of filter in terms of where we go in ground truth. woodlands and using what we find on the ground. So what species there, what ground floor is associated with that, where is it in the landscape? We can come to a pretty robust conclusion of whether that remnant of trees is wild, of ancient origin, or has been planted in more recent centuries. Where it's of wild ancient origin, you then have the potential. You're then looking at a tree that's descended from colonization since the last ice age, and so you've got all that genetic diversity to maintain and bring forward, and that'll be very regionalized depending on where in the country you are. So yes, that gives you a more resilient set of seedlings to grow into a more diverse landscape of trees. And you might also have more seed in that seed bank and that soil that's associated with that kind of woodland history. So you can have a more robust ecological outcome through that. Plus, you're allowing nature to find its own way. So if a seed falls in appropriate soil and ground, chances are it'll struggle to survive and it'll just naturally pass, just naturally die off. That's how nature does these things and provides the kind of diversity of habitat that we'll see in a landscape. So you might have wooded landscapes that have sort of full canopy, closed canopy woodland through to very scattered trees through to completely open ground. And in that diversity of habitat, that allows for the diversity of life.
Yeah, and so is anyone, because we were talking a little bit before we started about natural processes, is anyone doing the work of looking at some of these naturally regenerated forests and the natural processes that are occurring in the soil and the ecosystem around the trees versus ones that have been, established more recently, for example, or somewhere where we don't think they were originally?
Yeah, there are some different studies going on into that. And yeah, looking at how rich are the soils, what's coming in there in terms of nutrient level, can you trace that back to how recent the regeneration was or the planting as a control? And what are we seeing there? One of the missing elements of that is how well we understand the mycorrhizal component of the soil and whether that's present and has the chance to recolonize. One of the reasons regeneration can fail is if there's no mycorrhizae and planting can fail if there are no mycorrhizae present to kind of feed those trees for the long term, then eventually it's going to run out of nutrient and the tree will die. So understanding that more fully, I think, is one of the kind of frontiers that people are pushing at. Like in GHI are doing that. We're doing some work with people from Oxford. That work as well at Dundragon.
Well, it'd be fascinating to know more about. If there's any links, if any of that work is public, maybe you could ding it over to me and we could put it in the notes under the podcast if anyone's interested.
Yeah. I can have a quick word with Dr. Emily Warner, who's doing some of that stuff for us in Oxford, and she's the one on the cusp of that, or one of the ones on the cusp of that.
Yeah, because I think it's so important, isn't it? We get really obsessed with stems per, trees, and then forget that there's a whole nother world going on there, and that's continuously evolving as well, as opposed to something static.
Yeah, that's one of our touchy nerves. Actually, is this forestry-based approach to nature restoration, and we have grant schemes based around establishing timber crops, which is fine for establishing timber crops. Don't pretend to tell a proper forester what to do. But in terms of establishing nature, it's creating the conditions to allow actually nature to do all of that and trying to measure those processes through timber output metrics is a bit perverse. And that's skewed our grant system and our forestry support, our woodland and nature restoration support system, I should say, for far too long now.
Yeah, but I mean, there's potential for a lot of what you've been saying to translate across to even commercial forestry anyway, isn't there? Through continuous cover forestry, for example.
Yeah. So FPG, this is kind of where I sort of see all one of the big parts of the value of Forest Policy Group is to advocate for different approaches to silviculture and forestry and different forms of continuous cover, and for productive forestry to use natural regeneration, as happens in lots of other countries. So working at smaller volume and smaller scale, that allows so you can then selectively fail. You're looking for high quality timber often through those systems. You're taking down high value stems. You're processing them because you're working at smaller volume. There's more opportunity to process them locally. So you get the economic that you're adding the value in those local areas rather than taking them away to a central mill. and the area the forest is in has just provided the raw material and the values added somewhere else. So the opportunities that come for that for smaller economies in rural areas that can be disproportionately high and have really high benefits then for those communities and those economies. And on the forest itself, you've got the benefits of not having these sudden drastic changes in habitat cover like a clear fell operation would be. So you're sustaining tree cover, you're maintaining conditions for wildlife, and you're maintaining that forest in place. So all the ecosystem benefits of just having trees on that land are sustained indefinitely.
Yeah. Sorry, I did warn you my dog would stop making a nest halfway through, and that's that happening. And yeah, and I guess, yeah, it will remain to be seen, I guess, over the next sort of decade or so, if that could be a more resilient possibility for commercial forestry as well as, more broadleaf natural regen. I'm going to give you a break and give you some quicker fire questions now.
Yeah.
A brain break. So if you had 60 seconds in the lift with the Scottish Government Cabinet, what would you ask for? And we're still talking trees or your general work thing, just to be clear.
I think I go straight back to that big challenge mentioned earlier. I'd say fund deer management in a way that will kind of meet the costs and allow the deer management skills and jobs we need and bring so many other benefits to sustain whilst delivering the change we need in landscapes. If we don't, we will fail, and all these bills we pass and policies we write won't actually be deliverable on the ground.
And is there anything that you haven't touched on already that you think is a really frustrating disconnect, between on the ground restoration and high level forest policy?
I have mentioned already. I want to come back to is that the commercial forestry approach to restoration.
Okay.
We have a forestry grant scheme built around that, and it's nature doesn't follow a rule of guidebooks, a guidebook of rules, or a book of rules.
Yeah. Oh well, it's up for review, isn't it? There's tweaks coming, so
yeah,
we'll see. Unless you've got any recommendations that you feel like sharing when you've just been put on the spot for what you'd want to see change in that scheme, but just say no if you haven't, it's fine.
I think the tools are there to measure ecological restoration, and we should use those. And design schemes with enough flexibility that allow for the variation in the real world and not pretend everywhere the real world or the landscape is some kind of factory that you can predictably predict a rate of outcomes that are going to come off some sort of mythical conveyor belt.
Yeah, well, actually, that brings me on to I have got one more question for you at the end. But the question you were left by the last person on the podcast, who is Julia Farrington from Kilster Forest Community Group, wanted to know what your thoughts on uncertainty are, with respect to climate change, all of the issues we're facing with respect to forestry and restoration.
In some ways, I welcome it because prior to 10 years ago, it felt like there was too much certainty. There was too much just fixed by economic priority. And we could tweak about within that, but we couldn't really deal with the kind of the systemic causes of nature decline. And so as terrifying as climate change is, it's at least provided impetus to look at the system more and to think a bit more what's causing this at the bottom, underneath all of this.
Yes.
Plus to be more imaginative about how you solve those things.
Yeah, so there's actually a real opportunity around looking at how we adapt to just rethink what we do from a sort of step back perspective.
Yeah. And I'll briefly channel Anna Lawrence here if anybody's familiar. So through Forest Policy Group, we ran the Better Forestry Conference 2 years ago now, almost. It was Anna that put everything in the context of that uncertainty and said this requires innovation, and innovation requires collaboration and coming together. So I think that's just a real kind of theme about how we answer these challenges ahead is to have bigger coalitions
Hmm.
and to put all the crap that has kind of kept parts of those coalitions apart to one side and say there are new opportunities here. We're trying to build towards something better. This hasn't worked for pick your number of years or decades in which you feel the system has been failing or the situation has been failing. We need to do something different. And that's very liberating
Hmm.
to be able to think in those ways and actually, my experience of the common ground form is that people have a real hunger for that.
Mm. Yeah,
People are like when they're offered that is like this is way better than the old shape.
yeah, and it's so much nicer, right? Being able to speak to each other and get on. So it's nice. It's beautiful that that's circled right back round to the collaboration. That you were talking about earlier on as well. So, and it's nice to have something slightly less grim, isn't it, to sort of think about in terms of like how we face what's coming. Yeah.
Yeah, it's bad enough without having to be angry with each other all the
Yeah,
time.
exactly. It's so tiring.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just give you one last question and then we'll let you get on with your Friday evening. What's the forestry buzzword you think we could or should ditch?
Uh, I'll channel Anna again and say right tree, right place.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's just meaningless. I hate it. It's not, it's like it's presented as an answer
Mm-hmm.
and it's just become a known. I get the intent and the everything behind it, and it's not wrong, it's just annoying. It's just annoyingly not answering the challenge and the situation we have. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to think more about systemically, I think about kind of what to change around. How do we have landscapes that work more rather than just trying to do it tree by tree?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Very wise words. Okay, so on that note, I will say a huge thank you to coming along and giving up your time today. And a huge thank you to everybody who's either listening or watching this. Don't forget, if you want to get notified when we have new podcasts coming out, you can hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to, and then you'll know when the next one's released. So thank you, Alan. Bye for now.
Thanks, Mog. Catch you later.
Thanks for listening. If something sparked a thought, a memory, or a bit of healthy friction, that's what we're here for. If you'd like to be part of a future conversation, please drop us a line. You can sign up to the Forest Policy Group or support the work we do with a donation. It all helps to keep things moving forward. Until next time, take care.